January 1944. Over the frozen airfields of northern Europe, German commanders watched in disbelief as a lone American fighter clawed upward through the pale morning sky, steeper, faster, higher than any of their elite pilots could follow. Engines screamed, altimeters spun, and their proud squadron stalled helplessly beneath him. What happened next would shatter their confidence forever. Before we continue, tap like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from for more powerful WW2 stories. In early 1944, the air war over Europe entered a phase that German commanders believed they still controlled. Years of combat experience had shaped a certain confidence, some might even call it pride, within the Luftwaffe's upper ranks. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 had dominated much of the early conflict, and although Germany was now under pressure on every front, many squadron leaders still trusted one belief completely: altitude belonged to them. Altitude had always been a symbol of mastery in aerial warfare. The pilot who held the sky above his enemy owned the initiative, the timing, and the momentum. German doctrine leaned heavily on this truth. Their elite squadrons trained relentlessly to intercept from above, diving with speed, using gravity as a weapon. They had refined this tactic over countless battles, and even as the war turned against them, the belief in their superior climb performance never wavered. What these commanders did not yet understand was that the American air effort had evolved faster than they realized. The U.S. Army Air Forces had poured resources into engineering, testing, and pushing the limits of high-altitude performance. Turbo-supercharged engines, refined weight distribution, and improved cooling systems allowed American fighters, especially those escorting the massive bomber streams, to reach heights the Germans had dismissed as unrealistic. The Luftwaffe still clung to the outdated assessments of 1942, unaware that 1944 was a different battlefield entirely. The American presence over Europe was no longer scattered or inexperienced. It was concentrated, organized, and increasingly confident. Bomber formations stretched across the horizon in tight, disciplined boxes, and the fighters that protected them were no longer the vulnerable companions German pilots once remembered. Instead, these escorts had become predators in their own right, faster, stronger, and flown by men who treated altitude not as a defensive necessity, but as a weapon of dominance. Among these pilots emerged a man the Americans quietly began calling the Bulldog. This was not a nickname awarded for theatrics or bravado. It came from a calm, relentless discipline and a climbing technique that defied expectations. He was not the type to boast, nor the type to chase glory. Instead, he possessed an endurance and mechanical sensitivity that allowed him to coax every bit of power from his engine, especially in vertical flight. Other pilots might climb in measured steps. He climbed with purpose, as if the sky itself were pulling him upward. The Germans had heard scattered reports of unusually aggressive American climb tactics, but few commanders took them seriously. They believed their own elite formations, composed of veterans from the Channel battles, the Eastern Front, and the Mediterranean, would remain untouchable in vertical engagements. They trusted their instincts, their training, and the proven abilities of their machines. The thought that an American could simply outclimb them felt out of line with their entire experience of the war. Yet while German assumptions remained frozen in time, American engineering mastered something Germany could not replicate: sustained high-altitude power. Turbo-superchargers allowed U.S. fighters to maintain engine output well above 20,000 feet, where German fighters often suffered airflow inefficiencies. The Luftwaffe still relied on older mechanical solutions, which performed beautifully at medium altitude but began to falter when pushed higher and steeper. In isolation, these technical differences might seem small. But in combat, where every second of climb decides who fires first, they became decisive. As winter gripped Europe, the skies grew sharper and thinner. Clouds flattened into pale sheets, and sunlight filtered through in weak, metallic layers. These were the conditions the Germans claimed to own. Cold air meant denser lift and better climb rates, or so they believed. The morning frost on their wings felt like a familiar promise. And yet, hidden beneath this confidence was a quiet shift: the Americans had optimized their machines specifically for this environment. By January 1944, the stage was set for a confrontation neither side fully anticipated. The German elite squadron, experienced, disciplined, and proud, prepared for another intercept mission under the assumption that altitude advantage belonged to them by default. Meanwhile, the Bulldog pilot prepared in silence, checking oil temperatures, adjusting fuel mix, and studying the climb envelope of his fighter with the precision of a craftsman who understood exactly what his aircraft could endure. In just a few hours, these two forces, one confident in tradition, the other empowered by adaptation, would meet in the frozen air above Europe. And it was there, in the thin, brittle sky, that a few seconds of vertical flight would humble an entire German command structure. And to understand why those seconds mattered so profoundly, we must explore how the Bulldog pilot became the one man capable of turning a climb into a humiliation. The man the Americans called the Bulldog did not earn his reputation from a single mission or moment of dramatic flair. His rise came from something far quieter, an almost stubborn discipline forged long before he ever crossed into combat airspace. Born in the American Midwest, he grew up in wide fields where the sky seemed endless. Flying had been his fascination since childhood, but by the time he entered military training, fascination had hardened into precision. He approached aviation the way a craftsman approaches a tool, not with excitement, but with deep respect. During flight school, instructors noted something unusual. Most trainees showed confidence in formation flying or marksmanship, but this pilot excelled in a different category: engine management. He understood the mechanical heart of the aircraft as if he could sense the engine's mood through the throttle. Where others pushed forward aggressively, he learned when to ease back, when to adjust the mixture, and how to keep temperatures stable even under strain. This mechanical intuition became the foundation of his later dominance in vertical combat. While many pilots loved the thrill of aggressive maneuvers, the Bulldog treated every climb and dive as a measured equation. He studied airflow, fuel compression, supercharger stages, and the way wings carried weight at changing angles. This was not academic curiosity, it was preparation. He knew that survival in the air depended not on bravado, but on mastery. If the aircraft was pushed beyond its limits, no amount of courage would save the pilot. And if it was used correctly, even an enemy with more experience could be outflown. By the time he was assigned to a fighter group in Europe, he had already developed a reputation among his peers. Ground crews trusted him because he spoke their language, temperatures, pressures, tolerances. Fellow pilots respected him because he flew without wasted motion. His instructors recognized that he had something rare, the ability to operate at the edge of an aircraft's performance without crossing into recklessness. He flew smoothly, but decisively, with the calm focus of someone who understood that altitude was not a luxury, but a battlefield. When he arrived in England, winter storms swept across the airfields. Snow clung to the runways, wind ripped through maintenance tents, and the cold weighed heavily on every moving part of a fighter plane. But these were the conditions that played to his strengths. Thin air demanded exact throttle control, freezing temperatures tested coolant systems, and engines strained to maintain output. Where other pilots battled against these limitations, the Bulldog used them. German commanders did not know his name, nor did they care. To them, he was just another American escort pilot, one of many defending the lumbering bomber formations they sought to break apart. But American intelligence officers had already started to notice a pattern. Whenever a climb engagement occurred above 25,000 feet, reports repeatedly mentioned a single pilot achieving angles and ascent rates rarely seen in the unit. These were not stories of mythical exploits. They were grounded in numbers, time to climb measurements, directional changes, and fuel efficiency at high altitude. The data told a story before the newspapers ever would. Part of his success came from training, but another part came from something intangible: calm aggression. He never forced an engagement. Instead, he waited for the moment when the enemy thought they controlled the sky, then used their certainty against them. German doctrine relied heavily on predictable American responses. If U.S. fighters climbed slowly or hesitated, the Germans struck from above with overwhelming advantage. But the Bulldog did not hesitate. He climbed before they expected it, sustained power beyond what they planned for, and forced them into vertical contests they were not prepared to lose. This defiance of expectation created confusion in German reports. Pilots described American fighters pulling impossibly steep climbs or gaining altitude beyond anticipated performance. Commanders dismissed these claims at first, attributing them to misjudgment or unusual weather. But the truth was far simpler: American engineering had shifted the balance, and one pilot had mastered that advantage better than most. As January 1944 progressed, bomber missions intensified. Each escort flight carried higher stakes, and German pressure grew increasingly desperate. Their elite squadrons were ordered to regain control of altitude, at any cost. But for every attempt they made, the Bulldog seemed to be waiting. He was not always the first to be seen, but he was always the first to climb. His fellow pilots began to rely on him instinctively. If the formation needed altitude, he led the ascent. If the Germans attempted a high intercept, he countered. He became a benchmark within the squadron, proof that domination in vertical combat was not just possible, but achievable. German commanders, unaware of his growing influence, continued to believe their elite units could dictate the terms of engagement. They trusted in the legacy of their seasoned aces and the familiar performance of their aircraft. But they had not yet encountered the one pilot who turned the vertical sky into his personal battleground. And the moment their elite squadron finally confronted him, the illusion of German altitude supremacy would collapse. To see why this collapse was inevitable, we now examine the angles that shaped the coming confrontation. The confrontation that would humiliate the German commanders did not emerge from a single advantage, but from a quiet accumulation of details, small, technical truths and subtle tactical habits that, together, reshaped the sky long before anyone realized it. Every engagement in the air is a contest of geometry, weight, power, and timing. But above all, it is a contest of who understands these elements more completely. The Bulldog pilot understood them with a clarity his enemies never suspected. Long before the German elite squadron ever spotted him, he had already calculated the battlefield. He glanced at the bomber stream below, measured the drifting clouds above, and listened to the steady hum of his engine. To an inexperienced pilot, a climb looked simple: pull back, increase power, gain altitude. But to the Bulldog, a climb was a carefully managed ascent through shifting air densities and fragile engine tolerances. He knew exactly how much throttle he could apply before overheating the cylinders. He knew the angle at which lift would begin to bleed away, forcing the wings to carry more weight than they should. And he knew that altitude was not merely a number, it was a weapon. While he prepared to use altitude, the German squadron prepared to exploit it. Their commanders had built their entire doctrine on the belief that Americans could not match their climb rate. German fighters were lighter, sharper, and historically faster to gain height. Their pilots trusted that if they reached the upper sky first, they would dictate the fight. And for years, this confidence had been justified. But the war had changed, and the Bulldog pilot had changed with it. What the Germans did not expect was how the Americans had adapted their machines. Turbo superchargers allowed U.S. fighters to maintain power at altitudes where German engines began to gasp. At 20,000 feet, this difference was noticeable. At 25,000, it became significant. At 28,000 and beyond, it was decisive. The Bulldog knew how to ride that advantage with surgical precision. He managed his supercharger stages like a conductor directing an orchestra: smooth transitions, steady airflow, controlled temperatures. Every adjustment he made allowed him to climb just a little steeper, a little longer, a little higher. From the ground, the Germans believed they understood the limits of the American aircraft. Their intelligence reports still referenced older performance charts, outdated by months. They assumed that American fighters would stall if pushed too hard, or bleed energy too quickly in steep climbs. These were once correct ideas, but the Germans had not seen how drastically the Americans had refined their techniques. They were preparing for a version of the enemy that no longer existed. As the German elite squadron rose to intercept the bomber formation, their engines growled with familiar confidence. The climb was their domain, the vertical sky their arena. Their commander believed that once they reached altitude, they would look down upon the Americans, choose their moment, and descend with devastating speed. For years, they had practiced this ritual: climb, observe, strike. But on this morning, the Bulldog pilot had already begun his ascent before they even appeared. He felt the slight vibration shift as the supercharger engaged, sending fresh power through the aircraft. The climb angle sharpened. Frost shimmered off the wings. The world below fell away in quiet layers of gray and white. Each second he gained height, he gained control. Within minutes, he occupied the one position German doctrine insisted could belong only to them, the highest point in the sky. Yet the Germans had not seen him make the climb. They assumed altitude superiority was still theirs. Then the geometry changed. As the German formation neared the altitude where they expected to find bomber escorts laboring below them, they instead found nothing. No fighters struggling upward. No aircraft trailing behind. The sky was strangely empty. Confusion spread through the formation. Their leader adjusted heading, scanning the clouds for movement. Every instinct told him the Americans should be lower, weaker, climbing too slowly to interfere. And then, far above them, a thin contrail curved across the pale morning light. At first, they thought it belonged to a bomber. But the angle was too steep, too sharp. The line of vapor rose like a blade drawn across the sky. German pilots squinted upward, unable to understand how any fighter could climb at that angle without losing control. Only one pilot in the formation realized what it meant: they were no longer the hunters. They were beneath a man who used altitude with the confidence they once claimed as their own. Every assumption they held about American limitations was suddenly wrong. Every lesson they trusted was outmatched by a single pilot who turned vertical flight into dominance. And as the Bulldog continued climbing, drawing energy into his wings and power into his engine, the sky quietly began to tilt in his favor. What followed next would expose the human side of this confrontation, the resilience that shaped him, and the psychological unraveling that began within the German ranks. The moment the German pilots realized someone was above them, tension rippled through their formation like a silent crack. Even before the Bulldog made his presence fully known, the psychological shift had already begun. Altitude had been their identity, an unbroken tradition passed from one generation of Luftwaffe aces to the next. To look upward and see an American fighter silhouetted against the morning sky felt not just unfamiliar, but deeply unsettling. The Bulldog was unaware of their growing unease, yet he sensed the moment when dominance became his. Years of disciplined training had sharpened his instincts. He could feel the air change, the pressure lighten, and the engine settle into a smooth climb that only experience could maintain. But what truly set him apart was not the aircraft, it was a quiet resilience shaped long before combat tested him. He had learned early in life that control came from patience, not panic. Whether working under the burning sun of the Midwest or studying the mechanics of a stubborn engine, he cultivated a temperament that remained steady under stress. In the air, this steadiness became his greatest weapon. While other pilots tensed at high altitude or rushed maneuvers, the Bulldog conserved energy, managed airflow, and breathed in slow, controlled rhythms. His aircraft responded to his calm like a living thing, climbing higher as though it trusted him. Below him, the German pilots began to feel something unfamiliar: hesitation. Their training had prepared them for American fighters attacking from below or from the side, but not from above. And certainly not during a climb. German doctrine insisted that no U.S. fighter could sustain a steep ascent long enough to threaten their elite units. Altitude superiority was more than a tactic, it was a foundation. Now, with a single contrail cutting across the thin atmosphere above them, that foundation trembled. Their commander tried to maintain formation integrity. The plan had been clear: reach the bombers, strike fast, and descend before escorts could interfere. But the presence of an American fighter above them rewrote the geometry of the mission. Suddenly, the Germans were climbing into uncertainty. Every second they continued upward brought them closer to a position of vulnerability. If the American dove, they would have little room to build speed. If they attempted to outclimb him, they risked stalling in the thin air. The Bulldog understood the psychological edge he held, even if he could not see the tension below. To him, altitude was not dominance for its own sake. It was preparation, an opportunity to control time. A pilot above his enemy determined the first strike, the angle of attack, the pace of the engagement. He could choose when the fight began and when it ended. And he knew that this power weighed heavily on the minds of those beneath him. His aircraft held steady at the top of the sky, engine roaring with steady confidence as he leveled off for a brief moment. The canopy glinted against the cold light as he scanned the horizon. He spotted the German formation climbing in disciplined rows, their silhouettes dark and angular against the pale winter clouds. Experienced pilots, well-trained, moving with precision. But their precision could not mask the subtle drift in their formation, the small adjustments, the tiny breaks in spacing that revealed internal strain. Leadership inside the German unit struggled with a problem they had rarely confronted. Their confidence, once absolute, now faced a contradiction. Reports had warned of improved American climb performance, but such claims had been dismissed as exaggeration. Yet here it was, unmistakable, an American fighter occupying the sky that should have belonged to them. Commanders who had built careers on vertical superiority found themselves staring at a truth too sharp to ignore. In war, humiliation rarely arrives with spectacle. It arrives quietly, in moments when assumptions fall apart and pride becomes a weight instead of a shield. The German pilots felt that weight now. Their climb continued, engines straining, but the certainty that had guided them for years was fading. The sky no longer felt familiar. The angles they trusted were shifting beneath them. The Bulldog, meanwhile, began to prepare for what came next. He did not climb for show. He climbed to control. Every maneuver he made was calculated to place him exactly where he needed to be when the confrontation became inevitable. His breathing remained calm, steady. He was aware of his altitude, his fuel burn, his energy state, details etched into his mind through countless hours of practice. As he eased his aircraft into a slight banking turn, he began to align himself with the incoming formation. He felt no rush of adrenaline, no triumphant surge. Instead, he felt the weight of responsibility that accompanied every engagement. His role was to protect the bombers, to ensure that the mission succeeded, and to meet the enemy with the focus required to survive. Far below, the Germans steadied themselves, though their confidence had begun to fracture. They sensed they were climbing into a trap they had not expected, one set not by technology alone, but by a pilot who understood altitude in a way that challenged everything they believed. And as the distance between the two forces narrowed, the sky tightened into a narrow corridor of inevitability. The moment the Germans broke the last layer of cloud, they would see the Bulldog waiting, silent, steady, and in complete command of the vertical battlefield. The clash was seconds away. The The German formation pierced the upper cloud layer with the confidence of men who had done it 100 times before, only this time, as the sky opened, they saw something they were never trained to expect. High above them, small against the pale winter sun, the Bulldog's fighter held position like a sentinel carved from the frozen air. He was not diving, not turning, not wavering. He waited with the unsettling calm of someone completely certain of the next move. For a moment, time felt suspended. The Germans, mid-climb, stared upward through curved canopies, their engines straining against the thin air. Their ascent slowed as they reached the altitude where performance faltered. Airflow thinned. Propellers bit less cleanly. The sky grew brittle around them. But the Bulldog was beyond those limits. His aircraft had already stabilized in thinner air, engine humming with the steady rhythm of a machine built precisely for this moment. He watched the German formation emerge, their climbing angle too steep, their speed decaying just enough to betray the strain. To him, it was a familiar sight, the subtle moment when the enemy committed too much energy to the climb and had nothing left to respond. Below, the German commander felt the shift immediately. His instincts warned him that they were approaching the edge of control. The altimeter ticked upward slower than expected. His wingmen began adjusting throttle settings to compensate, but even disciplined formations carry small imperfections. He saw a ripple forming, a slight drift in spacing, a minor wobble in the left wing, a hesitation on the right. Indicators that his pilots were fighting their aircraft rather than mastering them. He keyed his throttle forward, trying to coax more power from an engine that was already protesting. The airframe shuddered. The Germans were reaching the altitude they believed belonged to them, but another pilot had already claimed it. The Bulldog read these signals with the clarity of someone who had spent years studying the edge of performance. He felt the cold wind press against the canopy, the shift in vibration through the stick. His aircraft was ready. The climb had given him far more than height, it gave him control of time. He could choose the second the engagement began. He eased the nose slightly downward, not enough to descend, but enough to gather a sliver of speed. The engine responded immediately, stabilizing with a low growl. His wings dipped just enough to position him directly above the Germans, where he could see the entire formation climbing like a row of dark needles stabbing toward the sun. Then came the moment every pilot learns to recognize, the point of no return. The Germans had committed too much to the climb. Their angle was too steep, their airspeed too low, and their altitudes too high to correct cleanly. To abandon the climb risked stalling. To continue risked becoming targets. They were suspended in a vertical trap of their own making. The Bulldog adjusted trim and prepared for the break. He kept breathing steady, counting silently, not seconds, but distances. 1,000 feet separation. 800. 600. Below, the German commander made a final attempt to correct. He gestured for his pilots to fan out into attack positions, but the spacing was wrong. Their energy states uneven. The climb had already fractured their cohesion. The Bulldog knew the timing had arrived. He slid his left wing gently downward, rolled the aircraft into position, and let gravity begin to assist. The nose dipped into a controlled arc, not a dive yet, but the preparation for one. The sunlight caught the canopy, glinting sharply as his fighter shifted into the first motion of dominance. From below, the Germans finally understood. They saw the American fighter tilt with purpose. Not flailing, not struggling, executing. Their radios erupted with short warnings, clipped breaths, and tense updates. The commander tried to bark out a correction, but altitude had stolen his voice. His pilots were too busy fighting the controls to respond cleanly. The Bulldog completed his roll, inverted for a fraction of a second, and aligned his nose directly down the German formation's central axis. His aircraft picked up speed quickly, cleanly, the thin air shrinking around him as gravity added its own weight to his decision. The German fighters, still climbing, were now trapped beneath him, unable to reposition, unable to outrun the descent that was about to begin. The Bulldog felt the controls tighten, the air press harder against his wings. He pushed forward gently, letting the dive build with elegant precision. The first pass was seconds away. Below him, the German formation stretched like a target grid, chaotic, uneven, exposed. It was in this instant, as the Bulldog committed to the attack, that the true humiliation of the German commanders began. Everything they believed about their advantage, about altitude, about climb, about control, collapsed under the weight of a single American pilot who had mastered the very sky they claimed as their own. And as he descended into the attack run, the battle shifted from tension to inevitability. The real breaking point was coming next. The Bulldog's dive tightened into a clean, disciplined attack run, the kind that only comes from absolute command of altitude and timing. The thin, frozen air whistled around the canopy as the world below expanded into sharp detail. German fighters, some still climbing, others already wavering, filled the sky in broken layers. They were not positioned to fight. They were positioned to be struck. He adjusted the throttle with small, precise movements, letting the dive build just enough speed to maintain control without overshooting his first target. The Germans were trying to scatter now, but their climb had robbed them of maneuverability. Several attempted shallow turns, but with low airspeed and high altitude, each motion felt sluggish, almost desperate. Their wings fought the thin air, their engines struggled to recover. They were trapped inside the vertical corridor the Bulldog had chosen for them. The German commander saw the oncoming threat with a clarity that bordered on dread. The American fighter was not diving with reckless aggression. It was descending with intent, with the cold, structured precision of someone who understood that this moment had already been decided long before the first bullet was fired. The commander tried to bank left to lead his unit out of danger, but the formation no longer moved as a single entity. Individual pilots made individual choices, each responding to panic at a slightly different pace. The symmetrical discipline that had once defined them fractured into scattered arcs across the sky. The Bulldog locked onto the first fighter, a Bf-109, trying to pull into a climbing turn. The German pilot attempted to use the last bit of energy in his wings to escape upward, but the Bulldog had too much speed, too much altitude, too much control. He lined up the shot with the steady confidence of a man who trusted his instincts as much as his machine. A short burst of fire stitched across the sky. The round struck cleanly, and the German fighter rolled downward, trailing smoke, disappearing into the cloud deck below. The German radios erupted in frantic warnings. One voice called out altitude. Another called out headings. Another tried to direct the entire squadron into a defensive spiral. But the commands overlapped, tangled, contradicted. The Germans were fighting gravity as much as the enemy. Their once elite formation had devolved into a chaotic struggle for survival, each pilot trying to regain enough speed to maneuver, none of them working together as they once had. The Bulldog did not pause. His aircraft cut through the formation with the sharp precision of a knife-slicing cloth. He rolled into a low G arc and climbed slightly, regaining position for a second pass. The Germans were still trying to recover their formation, but recovery was impossible. Their climb had become a trap that stripped them of energy and left them exposed. Every second they spent trying to regroup placed them deeper into the Bulldog's control. One German pilot attempted to dive out of danger, hoping to gain speed quickly, but he made the move too late. The Bulldog anticipated the descent and slipped into his path with a fluid motion. Another burst of fire. Another aircraft spiraled away. The Bulldog didn't linger to watch it fall. He had learned long ago that the battle was not in the spectacle but in the execution. For the German commander, humiliation settled like frost across the inside of his canopy. He watched his pilots fall, not because of inexperience or lack of courage, but because the very tactic that was supposed to protect them had betrayed them. He had led them into the climb believing they would own the sky. Instead, they had climbed into the jaws of a pilot who understood altitude more completely than any of them had been trained to imagine. The commander tried one final maneuver, an attempt to pull his remaining wingmen into a rolling dive toward thicker air where their engines would breathe more freely. But the Bulldog was already aligning himself for a third pass. This time he did not need to fire. The Germans were breaking apart on their own, streaking downward in uncontrolled trajectories, abandoning their attack mission altogether. Some dove steeply toward the cloud deck. Others leveled off too early and stalled. A few fled west, hoping to escape before the Bulldog could reposition. What became clear in those chaotic seconds was that the German squadron had not simply lost the engagement. They had lost the doctrine that had defined them. The Bulldog had turned their greatest strength into their greatest vulnerability, and the humiliation rippled through every pilot, every radio call, every failed attempt to reform. As the Bulldog climbed calmly back toward the bomber stream, his engine steady and unhurried, the Germans disappeared into scattered vectors of retreat. The sky grew quiet again, cold and pale, carrying the hush that follows a battle where one side never truly had a chance. The remnants of the German squadron limped home with empty fuel tanks, shaken nerves, and the realization that their commander's confidence had cost them dearly. Reports would be filed, explanations demanded, excuses offered, but none could erase the simple truth: an American pilot had outclimbed, outpositioned, and outthought an elite Luftwaffe unit in their own vertical domain. And in the hours that followed, the consequences of that humiliation would begin to unfold both on the ground and in the broader arc of the air war. The German airfield was unusually quiet when the remnants of the squadron returned. Winter winds scraped across the runway, carrying the dull roar of engines that sounded weaker, somehow older, than they had that morning. Ground crews rushed toward the landing aircraft, expecting to greet a victorious intercept team. Instead, they found a fractured formation limping home, fuel nearly gone, faces pale behind glass, and wings trembling from the stress of a failed climb. The first pilot to step down from his cockpit did so with shoulders that sagged beneath the weight of humiliation he could not yet put into words. Mechanics looked for bullet holes or signs of mechanical failure, but found none. Their fighters had not been torn apart by enemy fire. They had been broken by physics, by geometry, by tactical collapse. The truth sat heavily between every man on the airfield. The squadron commander arrived last. He removed his oxygen mask with a slow, deliberate motion, as if buying time before acknowledging what had happened. He avoided eye contact with his men. He knew what they were thinking because he felt it himself: confusion, disbelief, and a quiet ache of wounded pride. They had trained for years to dominate the climb, and yet a single American pilot had flipped their doctrine upside down. Inside the briefing room, the atmosphere was strained. A map of Northern Europe stretched across the wall, dotted with red and blue markers showing expected flight paths. The commander traced the intended intercept line with a trembling finger. Everything had seemed correct. The calculations, the timing, the altitude estimates, they all matched the doctrine they trusted. But the results were undeniable. Their reports reflected the unease. One pilot described the American fighter as appearing from angles previously thought unreachable. Another reported experiencing loss of climb control at unexpected altitudes. And though the commander resisted the phrasing, his own report highlighted the truth: the American aircraft maintained sustained power at levels beyond predicted capability. It was a statement that carried consequences far larger than the failed mission. Meanwhile, across the channel, the Bulldog pilot landed among the steady hum of Allied engines and the rhythmic clatter of ground crews preparing for the next mission. There were no cheers, no dramatic welcomes. His return was greeted with quiet nods from men who understood the significance of altitude far more than the enemy realized. Ground personnel checked his aircraft, noting minimal stress on the engine, clean temperature readings, and optimal fuel usage despite the climb and attack runs. In the debriefing tent, his report was concise. He did not speak of humiliation or dominance. He wrote simply about energy states, positioning, timing, and the moment when the German formation committed too much to the climb. To him, the engagement had been straightforward, a matter of preparation meeting opportunity. But intelligence officers reading his report understood its deeper meaning. The Bulldog's climb had not merely won a fight. It had shattered an illusion. Across the European theater, word spread quietly through Allied command channels. Discussions filled strategy rooms where maps were pinned and altitudes marked. American engineers revisited performance charts with renewed pride, recognizing that their work was not only improving survival but reshaping the vertical dimension of the war. Pilots across multiple fighter groups heard the story and took it as both inspiration and confirmation: the sky above 25,000 feet was no longer German territory. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological impact was deeper than any loss of aircraft. It was a crack in the foundation of their confidence. Climb superiority had been one of the pillars of their air power identity. If an American fighter could not only match them but surpass them in the vertical domain, then the Luftwaffe's strategic worldview required rewriting. And rewriting doctrine in wartime is more than a challenge, it is a reckoning. In the weeks that followed, German commanders attempted to adapt. They experimented with modified climb paths, altered formation spacing, and revised intercept angles. But adaptation requires time, and time was a luxury Germany no longer possessed. Fuel shortages, experienced pilot losses, and strained manufacturing meant that every new tactic was implemented by fewer men with fewer resources. The Bulldog, however, continued flying mission after mission, each climb reinforcing the idea that American air power had matured into something the enemy had underestimated for far too long. His discipline, his calm control, and his mastery of vertical combat became an unspoken symbol within his squadron, a reminder that dominance was not always loud, not always dramatic, but often precise and earned through relentless focus. Years later, historians analyzing the air war would point to moments like this as turning points not because of the number of aircraft lost, but because of what they revealed. Warfare is shaped as much by psychology as by machinery. When a belief collapses, especially one as foundational as altitude superiority, the shock ripples through every layer of command. And in the frozen January sky of 1944, that collapse began with a single contrail rising higher than German commanders believed possible, drawn by a pilot whose calm determination reshaped the balance of the air war. The Bulldog's climb became more than a tactical victory. It became a reminder that in war, dominance belongs not to tradition, but to those who rise, literally and figuratively, beyond the limits others accept.